She hid my photos, never invited me to parties, made jokes about me. You ruined the atmosphere. Then her groom ran away right before the altar, and only I stayed by her side. I always knew I was different. While other kids were making friends effortlessly, I'd sit in the corner of the classroom, doodling in my notebook or reading books that were way above my grade level. My sister was the complete opposite, popular, outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. She was 3 years older than me, and from as far back as I can remember, she treated me like I was some kind of embarrassing secret. Growing up in our house was like living in two different worlds. There was her world, filled with friends constantly coming over, phone calls that lasted hours, and weekend plans that always seemed to involve large groups of people. Then there was my world, quiet, solitary, spent mostly in my room with my books, my art supplies, and my thoughts. Mom and Dad never really knew what to do with me. They weren't mean about it, but I could tell they were always a little worried, always wondering if I was normal enough. My sister made sure I knew exactly what she thought about me. When family photos were taken, she'd somehow always manage to position herself so I'd be partially blocked or cut off when the pictures were printed. When her friends came over, she'd tell me to stay in my room because I made things weird. She never said it directly to my face back then, but I heard her on the phone with her friends, laughing about her freak brother who preferred books to people. The worst part wasn't even the exclusion. It was the constant feeling that I was somehow broken. Every family gathering, every school event, every social situation felt like a test I was failing just by being myself. I'd watch other families where siblings actually seemed to like each other, where the older kids would include their younger siblings in things, and I'd wonder what was wrong with me that made my own sister so ashamed of my existence. High school was particularly brutal. My sister was a senior when I was a freshman, and she made it very clear that we were not to acknowledge each other in the hallways. She had her popular crowd, her boyfriend, her activities, and I had my small group of equally quiet friends who mostly bonded over our shared love of things that the popular kids found weird. I got used to being invisible, to blending into the background, to being the kid that teachers remembered for turning in good work but never for participating in class discussions. The sociopath comment came during my junior year. I'd been accepted into a summer program for gifted students, something I was actually excited about. When I told the family at dinner, instead of congratulations, my sister rolled her eyes and said I was probably perfect for it since I had no social skills anyway. When Dad asked her what she meant, she said I was basically a sociopath who couldn't connect with normal people. The word stung because part of me worried she might be right. I did struggle with social cues. I did prefer being alone, and I did sometimes feel like I was watching other people's emotions from behind glass, understanding them intellectually but not feeling them the same way. After she graduated and moved away for college, I thought things might get better. And in some ways, they did. I had more space to be myself, to explore my interests without constant judgment. I got really into photography, spent hours hiking alone in the woods behind our house, capturing images of things that most people would walk right past. I started writing, too, not stories, exactly, but observations about the world, about the way light fell through leaves, about the patterns I noticed in people's behavior. But even with the physical distance, the damage was done. Family events became exercises in endurance. My sister would come home for holidays and immediately fall back into her old patterns. She'd show photos of her college friends, her sorority events, her boyfriend, and somehow never managed to mention me to anyone. If people asked about her family, she'd talk about our parents, our cousins, our grandparents, but skip right over me like I didn't exist. The photo cutting incident happened during my senior year. We'd had a big family reunion, and Mom had ordered prints of all the photos to make albums for everyone. When my sister's album arrived, I noticed that in every group shot, I'd been carefully cropped out. Not accidentally, the cuts were too precise, too intentional. When I asked Mom about it, she got this uncomfortable look and said my sister had requested some edited versions for her own album. That's when I realized that to my sister, I wasn't just an embarrassment, I was someone she literally wanted to erase from her life story. College was my escape. I went to a small liberal arts school about 6 hours away, far enough that I couldn't easily come home for random weekends, close enough that I couldn't use distance as an excuse to skip major holidays. I found my people there, other quiet, thoughtful kids who appreciated depth over surface-level socializing. I had a girlfriend for a while, someone who understood my need for solitude and didn't try to fix me or make me more outgoing. I studied literature and philosophy, spent hours in the library, and for the first time in my life, Felt like I was in a place where my way of being in the world was not just accepted but valued. My sister, meanwhile, had transferred to a bigger state school where she joined a sorority and seemed to be living the exact life she'd always wanted. Her social media was a constant stream of parties, formal events, and group photos with dozens of friends. She was studying communications and dating a guy who was in a fraternity and seemed to be everything I wasn't: loud, confident, the kind of person who could command attention just by walking into a room. When she announced her engagement during my sophomore year, I wasn't surprised. What had surprised me was that she actually called to tell me herself, rather than just letting me find out through mom and dad. The conversation was awkward and brief, but she seemed genuinely happy, and for a moment, I let myself hope that maybe this new chapter in her life would mean a new chapter for our relationship too. The wedding planning process quickly disabused me of that notion. Every decision seemed designed to minimize my involvement. I wasn't asked to be in the wedding party, which was fine. I wouldn't have wanted to be anyway. But I also wasn't consulted about anything, wasn't invited to any of the pre-wedding events, and got the distinct impression that my presence was more of an obligation than a desire. The bachelor and bachelorette parties happened the same weekend, and I wasn't invited to his bachelor party. I found out later that it was because my sister had told her fiancé that I was antisocial and would bring down the mood. I spent that weekend alone in my dorm room, trying to finish a paper and pretending it didn't hurt that my own sister's future husband had been warned against including me in his celebration. The rehearsal dinner was the first time I met him properly. He seemed nice enough, if a bit overwhelmed by the whole wedding process. He made polite conversation with me, asked about school, seemed genuinely interested in my answers. For a moment, I thought maybe my sister had been wrong about me, or maybe he was just good at hiding his discomfort with my presence. But then I overheard a conversation between him and one of his groomsmen later that evening. They were talking about the wedding, about how nervous he was, and his friend mentioned something about my sister's family. He said something about how it was good that the weird brother would be sitting in the back and probably wouldn't interact with anyone. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. This was how my sister described me to the person she was going to marry, as someone to be managed and contained rather than celebrated. The night before the wedding, I seriously considered not going. I'd driven home from college that afternoon, and as I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by all the books and art supplies and evidence of my solitary interests, I wondered what the point was. It was clear that my presence was unwanted, that I was seen as a liability rather than a loved family member. Why put myself through the pain of sitting in a room full of people who had been told I was strange and antisocial? But something kept me from backing out. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the fact that despite everything, she was still my sister, and this was still one of the most important days of her life. I wanted to be there, even if she didn't want me there. The morning of the wedding, I put on my suit, not a rental like the groomsmen, just a simple black suit I'd bought for job interviews, and drove to the church. I'd been assigned a seat in the back, far from the family section, next to some distant relatives I barely knew. The church was beautiful, decorated with white flowers and ribbons, filled with people who all seemed to know each other and be part of some larger social network that I'd never been invited to join. I watched as the groomsmen filed in, looking nervous but excited. I watched as the bridesmaids walked down the aisle in their matching dresses, smiling and perfect. I watched as my parents were seated in the front row, looking proud and emotional. And then the music changed, and everyone stood up, and I saw my sister at the back of the church in her wedding dress. She looked beautiful, of course. She'd always been beautiful, but there was something different about her that day, something radiant and hopeful that I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, all the hurt and resentment faded away, and I was just a brother watching his sister on her wedding day, feeling proud and happy for her despite everything. She started walking down the aisle, and I could see her fiancé at the altar, smiling and waiting for her. Everything seemed perfect, exactly like the fairy tale wedding she'd always dreamed of. But as she got closer to the front of the church, I noticed something was wrong. Her fiancé looked pale, panicked even. He was fidgeting with his tie, looking around the room like he was searching for an escape route. Update 1. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. Just as my sister reached the halfway point of the aisle, her fiancé suddenly stepped back from the altar. He said something to the officiant, something I couldn't hear from where I was sitting, but the pastor's face went white. Then, without any explanation, without any warning, he walked quickly down the side aisle and out of the church. The music stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, her bouquet trembling in her hands, looking around in confusion. The officiant cleared his throat and made some awkward announcement about needing a moment, and then chaos erupted. People started whispering, then talking, then some started getting up and leaving. My sister's maid of honor rushed to her side, but I could see from where I was sitting that she was crying, that she didn't know what to do any more than anyone else did. My parents had gotten up from their seats and were trying to figure out what was happening, but the groomsmen were just standing there looking as shocked as everyone else. I watched this all unfold from my seat in the back, feeling like I was witnessing a car accident in slow motion. My sister, who had always been so confident, so in control of every social situation, was falling apart in front of everyone she knew. All those people who had been there to celebrate her perfect day were now witnesses to her humiliation. Most of the guests didn't know what to do, so they started leaving. The wedding was obviously over, and there was nothing keeping them there. I watched as person after person filed out of the church, some stopping to offer awkward condolences to my parents, others just escaping as quickly as possible from the uncomfortable situation. But I didn't leave. Something kept me in that pew, watching my sister's world collapse around her. Maybe it was the same stubbornness that had brought me to the wedding in the first place, or maybe it was something deeper, a recognition that this was the moment when all the social hierarchies that had defined our relationships suddenly didn't matter anymore. The church emptied out pretty quickly. The wedding party was standing around in small groups, not knowing what to do with themselves. My sister was still in the middle of the aisle, and I could see that she was barely holding it together. Her maid of honor was trying to comfort her, but you could tell she was out of her depth. These were people who were used to things going according to plan, who had never had to deal with anything this publicly messy. I got up from my seat and walked down the aisle toward her. I didn't have a plan, didn't know what I was going to say or do. I just knew that she was my sister, and she was in pain, and everyone else was either gone or too shocked to be useful. When I reached her, she looked up at me with this expression I'd never seen before, completely vulnerable, completely lost. The girl who had spent our entire childhood making me feel like I was the one who didn't belong, who didn't know how to exist in the world, was now the one who looked like she didn't know how to function. I took her hand, and she didn't pull away. I led her out of the church, past the remaining guests, past the photographers who were still trying to figure out what had happened, past the wedding coordinator who was frantically making phone calls. We walked to my car, and I opened the passenger door for her. She got in without saying anything, still in her wedding dress, holding her bouquet like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. I drove us away from the church, away from all the people and the chaos and the questions, toward the downtown area where I remembered there was a little ice cream shop we used to go to when we were kids. The ice cream shop was still there, looking exactly the same as it had 15 years ago. I parked the car and went inside, leaving her sitting there in her wedding dress, and bought 2 cones, vanilla for her, chocolate for me, the same flavors we'd always gotten as children. When I came back to the car, she was crying. Not the pretty, delicate crying you see in movies, but the ugly, gut-wrenching sobs of someone whose entire world has just been shattered. I handed her the ice cream cone, and she took it automatically, like she was running on muscle memory. We sat there in the parking lot, eating ice cream in complete silence. She was still in her wedding dress, I was still in my suit, and we probably looked ridiculous to anyone who might have driven by. But for the first time in years, maybe in our entire lives, we were just 2 siblings sharing a moment without any of the usual tension or judgment. After a while, she stopped crying and looked at me. Her makeup was ruined, her hair was coming undone from its elaborate style, and there were ice cream stains on her dress. She said I was the first person who had stayed when she was at her ugliest, when she was at her most vulnerable. I told her to get used to it. Not because I was trying to be profound or meaningful, but because it was the truth. I wasn't going anywhere. I had never been going anywhere. I'd been there the whole time, even when she didn't want me to be, even when she was ashamed of me, even when she tried to cut me out of the family photos. That's when she told me about the phone call she'd gotten that morning. Her fiancé had been having doubts for weeks, apparently, but had been too afraid to say anything because the wedding was so expensive, because so many people were involved, because he didn't want to hurt her. But that morning, he'd finally worked up the courage to call it off. He told her he needed to speak with her before the ceremony, but she'd refused to take the call because she was too busy getting ready. So he'd waited until the last possible moment, until she was walking down the aisle, to make his escape. He'd told the officiant he couldn't go through with it and had literally run away from his own wedding. He'd left her standing there in front of everyone, with no explanation, no apology, no closure. Update 2. The next few days were a blur of canceled honeymoon reservations, return gifts, and uncomfortable phone calls. My sister moved back into our parents' house temporarily, and I drove home from college to be there for whatever came next. It was strange being in the same house again, but this time the dynamic was completely different. She was broken in a way I'd never seen before. The confident, popular girl who had always known exactly how to navigate social situations was now afraid to leave the house because she might run into someone who had been at the wedding. She'd lost not just her fiancé, but her entire sense of who she was. Her identity had been so wrapped up in being the perfect, successful, socially adept daughter that she didn't know how to exist without that framework. I found myself in the unexpected position of being the stable one, the one who knew how to be alone, who knew how to exist outside of other people's expectations. All those years of being comfortable with solitude, of not needing external validation, of being okay with being different, suddenly those weren't weaknesses anymore. They were strengths that my sister desperately needed to learn. We started taking walks together in the evenings, something we'd never done before. At first, she just needed to get out of the house, and I was the only person who didn't ask her awkward questions about how she was feeling or what she was going to do next. We'd walk through the neighborhoods where we'd grown up, past the houses of people we'd known in school, and she'd tell me things she'd never shared before. She told me about how exhausting it had been to always be on, to always be the person everyone expected her to be. She told me about how she'd envied my ability to just be myself, even when it meant being unpopular or misunderstood. She told me about how scared she'd always been that if people really knew her, they'd find her as boring and ordinary as she'd always felt inside. The revelation that my sister, who had seemed so confident and self-assured, had been struggling with her own insecurities all along was mind-blowing to me. I'd spent so many years assuming that her cruelty toward me came from a place of genuine superiority, but it turned out it had come from her own fear of being seen as inadequate. She also told me about her ex-fiancé, about how their relationship had been more about meeting expectations than about genuine connection. They'd looked good together, they'd fit into each other's social circles, they'd checked all the boxes that society says make for a good match. But they'd never really talked about the deep things, never really seen each other as complete people rather than just as partners in a socially acceptable relationship. 3 weeks after the wedding disaster, something unexpected happened. I was out running errands for Mom when I saw him, her ex-fiancé, at the grocery store. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, and when he saw me, he actually approached me. He told me he'd been wanting to reach out to my sister, but didn't know how. He said he knew what he'd done was unforgivable, that he'd handled it in the worst possible way, but that he'd been paralyzed by fear and social pressure. He said he'd been thinking about her constantly, not because he wanted to get back together, but because he realized he'd never actually tried to know her as a person rather than as a fiancé. This was the twist I hadn't seen coming. It turned out that he'd been struggling with the same things my sister had been, living up to expectations, being the person everyone wanted him to be rather than the person he actually was. The wedding hadn't been canceled because he didn't care about her, but because he'd finally realized that their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of social performance rather than genuine connection. He asked me to give her a letter he'd written, explaining everything he should have said weeks ago. In it, he apologized not just for leaving her at the altar, but for never really seeing her, for never asking her about her fears and dreams and doubts. He wrote about how he'd been so focused on the idea of marriage, on the social status of being married, that he'd forgotten to think about whether he actually knew the person he was marrying. When I gave my sister the letter, her reaction surprised me. Instead of anger or renewed heartbreak, she seemed almost relieved. She said it was the first time anyone had ever apologized to her for not really seeing her, for treating her like a role rather than a person. She said it made her realize that she'd been doing the same thing, playing the role of the perfect girlfriend, the perfect fiancé, without ever really examining whether that's who she actually was. But the biggest twist was still to come. A month after the wedding, my sister made a decision that shocked everyone, including me. She decided to take a year off from her life as she'd been living it. She quit her job in marketing, ended the lease on her apartment, and announced that she was going to travel alone for a year, something she'd never done before. Everyone thought she was having a breakdown, that she was making impulsive decisions because she was still processing the trauma of the wedding. But when she talked to me about it, I could see that it was actually the sanest thing she'd ever done. For the first time in her life, she was making a choice based on what she actually wanted rather than what was expected of her. She asked me to help her plan the trip, which was ironic since I was the one who'd always been seen as the antisocial one. But it turned out that all those years of being comfortable with solitude had taught me things about self-reliance and independence that she'd never learned. I helped her research destinations, figure out logistics, and most importantly, helped her get comfortable with the idea of being alone with herself. The night before she left, we sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by all the remnants of her old life, sorority photos, pictures with her ex-fiancé, awards and certificates from all her social achievements. She told me she was scared but excited, that for the first time in her life, she was going to find out who she really was when no one was watching. She also apologized to me, really apologized, for all the years of making me feel like I was wrong for being who I was. She said she'd spent so much energy trying to be normal that she'd never appreciated how brave it was to just be authentically yourself, even when it meant being different. She said she'd been jealous of my ability to be comfortable in my own skin while she'd always felt like she was wearing a costume. Update 3. My sister's year of travel changed everything, but not in the way anyone expected. She didn't come back transformed into some enlightened wanderer or spiritual guru. Instead, she came back as herself, really herself, for the first time in her life. She'd spent the year doing things she'd never imagined she could do alone. She'd hiked through national parks, taken cooking classes in small towns, volunteered at animal shelters, and spent long hours journaling in coffee shops. She'd learned to enjoy her own company, to make decisions based on her own preferences rather than what would look good to other people. When she returned, she was different in subtle but profound ways. She was quieter, more thoughtful, less concerned with filling every moment with activity or social interaction. She discovered that she actually enjoyed many of the things I'd always enjoyed: reading, spending time in nature, having deep conversations with just one or two people rather than being the center of attention in large groups. She also came back with a plan. She decided to go back to school to study environmental science, something she'd been interested in as a child but had abandoned because it wasn't considered prestigious or social enough. She'd realized during her travels that she cared deeply about conservation and sustainability, but she'd never allowed herself to pursue those interests because they didn't fit with the image she'd been trying to maintain. The biggest surprise was how our relationship changed. For the first time in our lives, we actually enjoyed each other's company. She'd call me from college to tell me about her classes, her research projects, her hiking trips. We'd meet for coffee when she was home, and we'd talk for hours about books, ideas, and experiences rather than just going through the motions of family obligation. She also started including me in her life in ways she never had before. When she made new friends in her program, she'd invite me to join them for dinner or movie nights. When she started dating again, she introduced me to her boyfriend early in the relationship, and she chose someone who appreciated the same things she learned to appreciate during her year away: authenticity, depth, and the ability to be comfortable with quiet moments. The real test came 2 years later, when she got engaged again. This time, everything was different. Her fiancé was someone she'd met in her graduate program, someone who shared her passion for environmental work and her newfound appreciation for a slower, more intentional way of living. Their relationship had grown gradually, built on genuine compatibility rather than social expectations. When she asked me to be in her wedding party this time, I was genuinely surprised. Not because I didn't think we'd gotten closer, but because I still couldn't quite believe that she actually wanted me there, front and center, as part of her important day. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a state park where she'd done some of her research. Instead of a formal church ceremony with hundreds of guests, it was just close family and a few dear friends. Instead of elaborate decorations and expensive flowers, they used wildflowers and simple decorations that reflected their shared values. I stood next to her as her bridesman, wearing a simple suit that I'd chosen myself rather than a rental that matched everyone else's. As I watched her exchange vows with someone who clearly saw and appreciated who she really was, I felt something I'd never felt before at a family event, like I truly belonged there, like my presence was wanted and valued rather than just tolerated. During her speech at the reception, she talked about how she'd learned that the most important relationships in life are the ones where you can be completely yourself, even when that self isn't perfect or socially acceptable. She looked directly at me and said that I'd taught her that lesson long before she was ready to learn it, just by being consistently and unapologetically myself. But the moment that really changed everything between us happened later that evening. We were sitting by the campfire after most of the guests had gone to bed, and she told me about a realization she'd had during her year of travel. She said she'd been thinking about all the years she'd spent trying to be the person everyone expected her to be, and she'd realized that the only person who had ever accepted her unconditionally was me. She said that even when she was cruel to me, even when she was ashamed of me, I had never stopped being her brother. I had never tried to change her or make her into someone else. I had just been there, consistently, waiting for her to be ready for a real relationship. She said that my quiet, steady presence had been the one constant in her life, even when she was too afraid to acknowledge it. That's when she told me something that completely reframed our entire childhood. She said that all those years when she was excluding me from things, she wasn't actually ashamed of me. She was ashamed of herself. She knew that I was more authentic, more genuine, more comfortable with who he was than she had ever been. She said that every time she looked at me, she was reminded of how much energy she was putting into being someone else, and it made her feel like a fraud. She said that cutting me out of photos and excluding me from events wasn't about protecting her image from my weirdness. It was about protecting herself from the uncomfortable truth that I was living more honestly than she was. She said that I represented everything she was afraid to be: genuine, independent, comfortable with solitude, unafraid of being different. The conversation lasted until sunrise, and by the end of it, we had both cried, both apologized, and both acknowledged that we'd wasted a lot of years misunderstanding each other. But we also both agreed that maybe we needed to go through all of that to get to where we were now, two adults who had learned to appreciate each other not despite our differences, but because of them. Final update. It's been 5 years since that conversation by the campfire, and our relationship continues to evolve in ways I never could have imagined. My sister and her husband have built a life that reflects their shared values. They live in a small town near a national forest. They both work in environmental conservation, and they've created a home that feels peaceful and authentic rather than performative. I finished my degree and moved to a city about 3 hours away from them, close enough that we can visit regularly but far enough that we each have our own space. I work as a freelance writer and photographer now, combining my love of solitude with my need to make a living. It's not a traditional career path, but it's one that fits who I am rather than who I think I should be. The most surprising development is that my sister and I have become genuine friends. We text regularly, share books and articles we think the other would find interesting, and plan hiking trips together. She's learned to appreciate quiet activities, and I've learned to be more open about my thoughts and feelings. We balance each other out in ways that feel natural rather than forced. She's also become one of my biggest advocates. When family members or old friends make comments about my unconventional lifestyle or my preference for solitude, she speaks up for me in ways she never did when we were growing up. She's learned to see my introversion and independence as strengths rather than weaknesses, and she's not afraid to challenge other people's assumptions about what makes a person valuable or successful. Last year, when I was going through a difficult period after a relationship ended, she was the person I called. She drove 3 hours to my apartment, brought groceries and tea, and spent the weekend just being there with me. She didn't try to fix me or give me advice or tell me what I should do next. She just sat with me in my sadness and reminded me that I didn't have to perform or pretend for her. It was during that weekend that I realized how much we'd both changed. The sister who had once been ashamed of my emotional depth was now someone who could hold space for my pain without trying to rush me through it. The brother who had once felt completely alien in his own family was now someone who could accept comfort and support without feeling like he was being judged or pitted. We also talk about our parents differently now. We've both come to understand that they did their best with the tools they had, but they didn't always know how to handle having two such different children. They favored my sister's social success because it was easier to understand and celebrate, but they weren't malicious about it. They just didn't know how to value the things that made me special. My sister has become much better at helping our parents understand me, and I've become better at appreciating the ways they did support me, even when they didn't fully understand what I needed. We've learned to be a family that celebrates different kinds of success, different ways of being in the world. The most profound change, though, is in how I see myself. For so many years, I believed that there was something fundamentally wrong with me, that my preference for solitude and my difficulty with social situations made me less valuable as a person. Having my sister not just accept but actively appreciate those qualities has helped me see them as part of what makes me who I am rather than as flaws to be fixed. I still prefer small gatherings to large parties. I still need plenty of alone time to recharge, and I still sometimes struggle with social situations that feel performative or superficial. But now I see those preferences as valid choices rather than personal failures. I've learned that there's nothing wrong with being the kind of person who prefers depth to breadth, quality to quantity, authenticity to popularity. My sister recently told me that watching me live authentically, even when it was difficult, gave her permission to eventually do the same. She said that my example showed her that it was possible to be happy without conforming to everyone else's expectations, that there were other ways to measure a successful life besides social approval and conventional achievements. She also told me that she's grateful for everything that happened, even the painful parts. She said that if her first wedding had gone according to plan, she might never have learned who she really was underneath all the social performance. She might have spent her whole life trying to be someone else's version of perfect instead of discovering her own version of authentic. Looking back, I can see that both of us needed to go through that experience to become the people we were meant to be. I needed to learn that my worth wasn't determined by other people's acceptance, and she needed to learn that her worth wasn't determined by other people's approval. We both needed to discover that the most important relationship we could have was with ourselves, and that authentic connections with others could only grow from that foundation. Now, when people ask me about my relationship with my sister, I tell them that we're living proof that people can change, that relationships can heal, and that sometimes the most profound transformations come from the most painful experiences. We're not the same people we were during those difficult years, but we're also not completely different. We're just more ourselves, more honest about who we are and what we need. The boy who was once ashamed of being different has learned to celebrate his uniqueness. The girl who was once afraid of being seen as imperfect has learned to embrace her authenticity. And together, we've created a relationship built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the understanding that love isn't about making someone else comfortable with who you are. It's about accepting them exactly as they are. Sometimes I think about that day at the ice cream shop, when my sister said I was the first person who stayed when she was ugly. What I've learned since then is that she was never ugly. She was just human. And what she's learned is that I was never weird. I was just myself. The difference between those two things is everything.